Have you ever wondered if you're actually spiritually open and curious, or if you just have trouble committing to a particular path or practice? In this video, I'm going to give you 3 tips to answer this question. Hey everyone! So whether you're someone who gets very concerned about not persisting with things, maybe, quitting a practice, or whether you're someone who feels like it's wonderful to embrace all kinds of different practices and paths, I think this is a good question for any of us to ask, because what is really the right thing for us, if there can be such a thing? I myself have had many different practices that I've tried in the spirit of interspirituality sometimes, or just because something particularly drew me. And not all of them have stayed with me, of course. However, I do have several practices, a couple from various traditions, that have stayed with me. And of course, if I hadn't even explored them in the first place, I wouldn't have them today. So how do we try to examine whether or not we're going in depth enough with our spiritual practices and paths? Or maybe on the other hand, if we're not being open enough and feeling like we need to persist with something that's not right for us. It's an important question, the depth question, because paths and practices are meant to be deep experiences that, if they're going to affect us and profoundly influence our experience of God, or whatever term you use, some people use the term mystery or source or universe. I tend to say God a lot. These practices are intended often to be taken at a great depth. And I think of a phrase like going through the eye of the needle that Jesus said, and that metaphor was also used in the Talmud. So are we really going through the eye of the needle, which can cause much more spiritual growth and development and connection to whatever we call God? Or are we too quickly, because often it's a difficult path, right? It's hard to persist with things. Are we too quickly leaving it be? On the other hand, are we not being open enough or acknowledging when something's not right, and maybe there's something else out there that's a better fit for us particularly, but also potentially for whatever part of the spiritual journey we're on? Because I do think that we are shedding ourselves and growing all the time, and when you do that, sometimes things fall away, or even more likely get more integrated into ourselves. And I'll talk a little bit more about how I've experienced that and realized that I'm integrating things that I thought have fallen away a little later in this video. Tip number 1 is, when you first try a practice, particularly a practice, but I think it could be true for exploring a path more generally as well, give it at least 21 days where you're really trying it before letting it go if it's feeling like you're not sure it's right for you. And I say this because our psychology and our brains are very much a part of this whole integrated journey that we're on. It's really all, not just all in our mind and concepts about things, but as you know from some of the practices, it's also your body, and then psychology is definitely in there as well. So the subconscious mind takes at least 21 days to start getting familiarized with something new. And we often don't persist with things that are, or go towards things that are outside of our subconscious comfort zone. And so it's very important to give a practice the chance to become something more familiar, so that it's not just our subconscious natural brain reaction of preferring familiarity, that is just something that developed over the course of time for humans in our brains, in terms of how we decided to stay safe and how to perceive the world. So that's the first tip. Even longer is better. I believe 60 days. I'm trying to remember from my psychology that I've learned. I believe 60 days is even better, but it takes at least until that 21 days for something to become more familiar. So hopefully by that point, you'd have more of a sense of whether it's right for you in other deeper ways, and not just because it doesn't feel familiar. Tip number 2 is to listen to all parts of yourself when making a decision and when trying to analyze if something feels right for you or not. So, and I would apply this as well to considering if you, just the question, asking yourself the question of if you're leaving something too early, is it because it's too difficult, something like that. So any of these questions, does the practice or path feel right? Does it look, what's the next step to take, could even be a good way to ask the question. It could be about analyzing what's really going on inside yourself, but try to listen don't just only do it logically. The logic can be a piece of it, but try to listen with other parts of your body as well. And I would say one that gets very neglected here is the actual physical body. So try to ask yourself the question and take the time, take a little bit of time, maybe close your eyes and feel into what it feels like. Sometimes people, if it's something that's more of a decision, it can be helpful to actually make one decision or the other and then see how it feels, and you get a feeling. It's some people call the gut a separate part, not because it's also part of the nervous system, that the gut and intuition is slightly different from the rest of the physical body. So I would say look at both. See if you get sort of that intuitive gut feeling, but also just notice any particular part of your body and what sensation arises. Trying not to put too many words and logic on it at first, and then afterwards you can try to see what meaning that you come to from it. But usually it will have a quality to it that doesn't require as much analysis. Usually you'll get a pretty clear sort of yes or no, or an invitation to look further. So perhaps maybe you'll feel some fear. And rather than just deciding, oh, well, it's just fear, I should keep going, I would say investigate that even a little further. So try to investigate where that fear is coming from. Because maybe it's a fear, it could be a fear of not persisting with the practice, right? Like maybe it's a fear that has more to do with one or the other side of the decision. So I would try to take that as information and not make a snap judgment on it, but explore it a little further. Tip number 3 could be used with a particular practice that you're thinking of leaving or that you're thinking of picking up again. But you could also ask this of yourself just in general if you'd like to think about this question more generally. So I'd ask you to examine a practice or path that you've left or that no longer seems to serve you, and ask yourself if there's any ways that that practice or path, whether it's in subtle ways or larger ways that you just maybe haven't noticed, has actually become part of you and integrated into you. And so for me, centering prayer, which is a Christian contemplative kind of meditation that I started doing probably back in 2010, and then it was my main practice, I would say, for at least 10 years. And then it started to fade out a little bit. And I began to understand that after first resisting leaving it because it had been so useful for me, I began to understand that I needed to do because centering prayer is more of a surrender kind of practice. And I realized that I needed to do more of a mindfulness type of practice. Surrender practices come very easily to me, and mindfulness practices tend to be more body-based or that kind of thing, and those more grounded type practices are harder for me. So I realized that I needed to pick that up, and I'd sort of known that and first been trying to add it in as a practice. And I can only see this looking back now, but I think what happened is that I needed to sort of leave the fact that that was my main practice, centering prayer, in order to more fully explore more mindfulness practices. And now I find that I'm more interested in centering prayer again, just recently after I've really found some mindfulness practices, some breath work particularly, that really feels right for me. But interestingly, just a few weeks ago, I became interested in a prison program where they offer centering prayer, and it just felt absolutely right to me. But my first question to myself was, because it's actually really just recently I'm starting to pick up the centering prayer again, was how am I the one to offer this? Yes, I had all those years of doing it, but how am I the right one to offer this if I'm not currently practicing it? And in exploring that, I didn't just do a snap judgment on it, but I explored it a bit, and I realized that I have taken it still with me. Even when I sort of let it go as an actual practice, a lot of centering prayer is also about taking it then into everyday life in the moment. And I had gone so far with it that I do use that surrender and that feeling of release and surrender in the moment. And I still have continued to use that all this time. So in a sense, I haven't stopped practicing it all this time. So I would ask you to examine for yourself if there's any practices or maybe even paths, that you've left, and maybe for very good reason, that they just didn't feel like a right fit, or maybe there was something where you had a bad experience with it. It was something you grew up with. But it can be really interesting to go back and to think if there's any parts of it that may still have been with you in a way that's integrated and is part of you now. And I think that can be a good way to think about this whole issue of how much are we exploring versus how much are we really in depth taking things in, because it's a little more nuanced than just, are we doing a path or not? Are we leaving a path or not? It goes into a little more of how we're interacting with all these paths that we might encounter or be on at various parts of our lives. So thank you so much for watching. I hope that you gained some insight from this video. I would love it if you like, share, and subscribe so we can get the content out there to other people and hopefully start to form a community where you can share your experiences in the comments. Already, I'd love to hear how the tips go for you, or maybe you already know that there's a practice that you left and you can see how it is continuing to influence you or be part of you. Bye.